I will not be silenced. This home is my family's legacy.
People like you were never meant to hold on to such things. This is procedure, nothing more, nothing less.
Then let procedure face the truth, because I will not back down.
The silence after Angela's words cut deeper than any gavel strike. Every eye in the room seemed to shift, the weight of history pressing against the polished walls, daring someone to break the stillness. Bennett's cold stare faltered, just for a breath, as if the ground beneath his authority had begun to tremble. And in that instant, the question loomed larger than ever. Was this the turning point where truth would finally rise above power? If this moment struck you, share your thoughts below. Do you believe justice will prevail? Leave a comment with one word, justice, and don't forget to like and follow for the next chapter. The morning air over West End carried the faint smell of cinnamon from someone's oven down the block, and the kind of cold that made a person tuck their chin into their scarf. Angela Robinson stood at her small kitchen table with a stack of manila folders spread like a fan, the lamp casting a warm circle of light over documents her mother had once called "our proof." On the wall, framed behind glass, was a photograph of her mother on the day the mortgage had been burned in a backyard fire pit, the smoke rising into the branches of the pecan tree. Her mother's voice, the kind that could fill a church basement without a microphone, seemed to drift through the room. "Hold on to this house, baby. It is our roots." She drew in a steadying breath and laid out the oldest papers, first property tax receipts, original loan statements, letters with embossed seals, then the newer envelopes that had arrived like unwelcome guests. Each was slit clean along the top and tucked with the precision of someone who had ironed uniforms for a living and taught a daughter to keep things in order. What did not belong was easy to spot. A single set of pages labeled Second Mortgage Agreement, dated not long before her mother passed. The signature at the bottom carried her mother's name, but the letters slanted wrong. The loops floated above the line, and the tail on the final letter was a timid curl her mother had never used. Angela had seen that, hand-signed report cards, birthday cards, church bake sale forms. It was wrong, and the wrongness made her chest tighten. She turned to the window. The street outside was quiet except for a delivery van and the squeak of a bicycle brake. Across the way, Mrs. Goodwin from 2 doors down wrestled a wreath onto her porch hook and waved. Angela waved back and tried to smile. The front room, with its creaking floorboards and the soft dent in the couch cushion where her mother had watched the news, held the weight of 3 generations. In that weight there was comfort and obligation. She rested a palm on the table as if to steady the room itself. A clock ticked. She picked up the phone, pressed the numbers to the customer service line, and braced her elbows on the table when the automated voice offered options in a cheerful tone that did not match the dread in her stomach. After a string of menus and a hold time that was long enough to make her tea go cold, a woman finally came on the line, introducing herself in a brisk voice from the foreclosure department. Angela explained carefully, with the clarity of a woman who had led intake interviews at the community center for years. Her mother's mortgage was paid in full. They had the deed. There had never been a second mortgage. "Ma'am, our records indicate otherwise," the woman said, as if reading a weather report. "The account is in default for non-payment on a secondary loan taken out 2 years prior." "That is not possible," Angela replied, keeping her voice level. "My mother did not sign a second loan. I am holding the original deed. I am looking at her actual signature." A pause. The clack of keys. "Perhaps you were not aware of her financial situation." The implication settled over the line like a film of oil, slick and hard to scrub away. Angela closed her eyes for a moment, then said, "I need copies of every document you are using to claim this debt. I want the original signatures. I want to know who notarized them." "You may request those through our legal department," the woman answered. "But it will not stop the eviction process." Angela kept her voice steady. "Please connect me to legal. I have given you the correct department and address. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" The call ended with a chirp that left the kitchen oddly silent. Outside, a bus sighed to a stop and someone called out hello to a neighbor. She stood, joined stiff from the cold, and brought the deed up to the lamp. The ink had faded a shade since the photograph on the wall was taken, but the curves were the same. The pressure on the downstrokes confident, the way her mother had signed checks with a flourish that said the world might be hard, but she would meet it with a firm hand. The starkness of the forged signature beside it made Angela feel as if the floor had shifted. She set the papers down and gathered her coat. The walk to the front door took her past the hallway photos. Her grandfather in a cap and gown from a time when getting that paper had meant ignoring a dozen glances that told him he did not belong. Her mother in a white dress on a church lawn, squinting into the summer sun. A younger Angela on the stoop with a toothy grin and scraped knees, holding a homework folder like a trophy. At the door, she paused long enough to pull on gloves and then stepped into the day. The streets of West End were a parade of brick and wood, metal railings wrapped in ribbon, and small porches that doubled as living rooms in warmer months. A man in a flannel jacket nodded to her as he carried a sack of groceries up a stoop. A child's laughter burst from behind a fence where chalk drawings in pastel loops migrated from one concrete square to the next. She crossed toward the bus stop, the second mortgage pages folded in her bag like contraband. The bus rumbled to a halt and she climbed aboard, dropping coins into the slot and greeting the driver with a good morning that he returned with a weary smile. She took a seat near the window and watched the city pass. The skyline rose in a neat cluster, glass and steel catching threads of Sunday. A billboard promised a winter sale with a photograph of a family in matching sweaters. The bus let workers off at an office tower, then turned toward the financial district, where the bank's logo gleamed above a row of revolving doors. Inside the lobby, warmth carried a faint scent of lemon and the hush of money being washed carefully. Angela approached the reception desk and explained that she needed to see someone about an error. The receptionist asked for her name, typed, then directed her to a bank of chairs under a framed photograph of a smiling couple holding a set of keys, the caption praising dreams coming true. She waited, palms pressed to the leather of her purse, while men in suits walked briskly past chatting into earpieces, and a woman in a navy skirt handed a clipboard to a man who kept insisting he was in a hurry. When the manager appeared, he wore the kind of smile that suggested the meeting would be short. Richard Bennett introduced himself, shook Angela's hand only after a beat, and led her to an office with a glass wall that kept the lobby in view like a fish tank. "Miss Robinson," he said, taking a seat and straightening his tie. "How can I help you today?" She placed the papers on the desk without shaking, a point of pride. "There is an error in your records," she said. "My mother never took out a second mortgage. Her home was paid off. The signature on this supposed agreement is not hers." He skimmed, lips tightening into what might have been a smirk. "Signatures can change with age," he said. "People make decisions their families know nothing about." "My mother did not keep secrets from me," Angela replied. "You can compare the signature here to the deed. The notary stamp looks suspect. It is faded, like it was copied. I need to see the originals." He slid the papers back across the desk with careful fingers, as if they might stain him. "Miss Robinson," the bank followed procedure. "If you wish to contest, you can hire legal counsel. The timeline is already in motion. I have a right to see the paperwork you are using to remove a person from her home," she said. "This house is a family legacy. It is more than lines on a spreadsheet." His gaze flicked to the glass. Will the lobby move along without them? He leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice as if confiding a practical truth. "This system is not built for people who come in after the fact with feelings," he said. "It is built for paperwork. You are free to try, but you will only make things harder for yourself." He stood as if the conversation were over, and she stood with him, gathering the pages she had brought, careful not to let them crumple. At the door he added, almost kindly, "Time is not on your side." All lies. On the sidewalk, the day felt brighter than it had in the lobby's false Sunday. She exhaled, looked up at the building that cast a shadow onto the crosswalk, and then down at the second mortgage pages again, as if they might admit their lie at last. She had worked long enough at the community center to know the cadence of a brush-off that would harden into stone if she let it. She could feel the memory of her mother's hand on her shoulder the day she had gotten her first paycheck. If we do not ask, no one answers. If we do not show up, someone else writes our story. On the bus home, she watched the rain begin to stitch lines on the window. At her stop, she stepped into air that smelled faintly of wet leaves and char from someone's smoker. The neighbors were beginning to string lights along railings. A boy tugged a small wagon up a short path and then waved when he saw her watching. She waved back. Inside, she made tea and phoned the community center to ask for the number of a legal clinic. A volunteer read it off slowly, and Angela repeated it, then wrote it in a notebook with a pencil that left a soft gray trail. When she called, the clinic's line sent her to a recording that said the caseload was full for now, and to try again next week. The afternoon faded into the kind of early darkness that came before the holiday season. She sat at the table and used a magnifying glass from the junk drawer to study the notary stamp. The ink indeed looked uneven, like a copy of a copy. The seal, when compared to a sample from a county website, did not match exactly. Her training as a social worker had not prepared her for mortgage law, but it had taught her to follow the thread until it led to the knot. She stacked the papers by date and made a timeline on a yellow pad. When her mother had signed the original deed, when insurance had been paid, when property taxes were due. She wrote out the holidays because that was how her mother had marked time: the first payment cleared by the time of the big Easter service, the last tax check written the week of the parade in the neighborhood, the mortgage burned on a summer Sunday after church when the corn was tall. As she wrote, the house settled around her with a familiar crack and sigh. The phone rang. It was the bank again, a different voice, smooth as a radio host. The man confirmed her name and property address, then said there had been a review. He spoke about process and compliance, about letters sent and deadlines set, until his words sounded like tires on wet pavement. When she interrupted to ask if they had a copy of the original signature, he paused for a heartbeat. "We can appreciate how difficult this is," he said. "Prepare to leave, Miss Robinson." The line clicked and went dead. Angela stared at the receiver as if it might confess. Then she set it down with care, pressed her palms to the table, and breathed. She walked into the front room where the late afternoon light had gone thin and blue. The photograph of her mother caught a sliver of lamp glow that made the edges of her smile stand out. From the kitchen, the kettle began to hum. On the street, a car door shut and a pair of neighbors called good evening to each other. Angela stood very still, the hush around her growing round and solid, like the inside of a church just before the hymn began. She reached for the picture frame and straightened it on the nail, not because it needed straightening, but because it steadied her hands to do it. Then, to the woman in the photograph and to the rooms that had held her all these years, she whispered, "I will not give up. I commit." The red envelope with the final notice rolled inside Angela's bag like a hot coal, reminding her of the promise she had made the night before beneath the old photograph on the living room wall. She arrived at the bank just after mid-morning, when the lobby was busiest and the floor smelled faintly of lemon polish and wool coats drying from a light rain. She paused by the revolving doors, smoothing her scarf, and thought of her mother's words about keeping roots alive in a city that sometimes pretended not to know their names. She would present the papers calmly, ask for the original signatures, and insist on seeing the notary record. She told herself that if she kept to the facts, if she met each stone with steady steps, the wall would give way. The reception desk sat under a framed photograph of a couple holding a set of keys, their smiles as bright as the caption that promised dreams realized. The young woman behind the desk greeted Angela with a professional warmth that did not invite conversation. After taking her name and the property address, she asked Angela to wait in a row of leather chairs. Men in suits crossed the lobby with briefcases, swinging time to quiet conversations. A woman in a blazer the color of winter sky guided a client toward the elevators. The muffled chime of a printer came from behind a frosted glass door. Angela folded her hands over her bag to steady them and watched the second hand of a wall clock slide past the numbers as if it had nowhere else to be. Richard Bennett stepped out with the air of someone already late to his next appointment. His tie was neatly knotted, his expression composed into a managerial smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He shook Angela's hand a beat later than he needed to, as if measuring something invisible, then motioned toward an office whose glass wall turned the lobby into a silent aquarium. He introduced himself again once the door was shut, sat behind the desk, so polished it reflected the ceiling lights, and asked how he could help. Angela laid the papers between them with careful precision. She explained the history of the house, the paid-off mortgage, The deed her mother had framed before the summer cookout, when neighbors had clapped and her grandfather had cried for the first time she could remember. She explained that a second mortgage had appeared in the file only after her mother's health had failed, that the signature on that agreement curved in ways her mother's hand never had. She named the right to see the original documents, the right to know who had notarized them and on what day and in what office. She spoke as a woman used to advocating for others, her voice steady even when the stakes were her own life. Bennett listened with the tilted head of a man allowing a familiar story to spool out. He skimmed the pages she had brought, placed a fingertip at the bottom where the forged signature lay like a bruise, and lifted one shoulder. He said that signatures evolve as people age, that families do not always know their elders' choices, that the bank followed procedure and the system recognized the debt. He used the word procedure several times, rolling it like a velvet rope to separate the bank side from Angela's. He suggested she might be confusing a home equity line with a second mortgage, and that legal counsel could help her understand the difference. She felt the warmth rise into her cheeks, not from embarrassment but from the careful disrespect braided into his sentences. She kept her voice measured. She asked for the originals again, said that a photocopy of a photocopy was not a record, and that a notary stamp should look like a seal pressed into the day, not like a shadow of a shadow. She said that the person whose signature appeared on the deed had taught her to write her name in first grade by covering her hand with a patient palm and tracing the letters slowly. She said that she had watched that same hand-signed checks with a firm downstroke that did not lift from the line, and that the loops here floated like they were afraid of being caught. His smile thinned. He pushed the papers back across the desk with 2 fingers, the way a person might slide a receipt across a counter. His gaze drifted to the glass wall where the lobby moved along, people entering and leaving as if nothing inside the office could touch them. Then he leaned forward a fraction, lowering his voice into something meant to sound like counsel from a seasoned professional. "You cannot win," he said, letting the consonants land like tacks. "This system is not built for you." Always, the words did not surprise her. She had heard the sentiment in other rooms with other carpet and other clocks. She absorbed them the way a tree absorbs a gust, bending without breaking. She asked for the bank's legal department address in writing, and he wrote it on a card, his pen scratching lightly as if even the ink were careful not to commit. He stood to end the meeting with a practiced gesture that closed 100 such conversations a month. When he offered his hand again, Angela took it, not refusing the contact but also not thanking him for the courtesy. Back in the lobby, the floor shine made moving feet appear to float. Angela stood for a moment between the elevators and the revolving door, feeling a current of cool air draft in with every turn of the glass. She remembered the final notice tucked into her bag and the laugh she shared as a child with her mother over a cocoa-stained recipe card that had never failed them. Memory could be a roof, she thought, but today it would be a ladder. She pressed through the revolving door and into the noon light that made the bank's steel letters glare. She did not go home right away. Instead, she crossed to a corner deli for a simple lunch and a chance to collect her breath. The place had chalkboard specials, the bell on the door clanged softly, and the young man at the counter called ma'am and asked how her day was going, not in the empty way people speak when they are already turning away, but with the open friendliness of a city that has learned kindness as a form of resistance. She ordered a bowl of chicken noodle soup and a roll, left a dollar bill in the tip jar with a nod, and took a table by the window where she watched office workers share stories over salads and a child drum a plastic spoon against a paper cup, until his mother's gentle hush turned the tap into a whisper. She ate slowly, letting the warmth settle her. When she paid, the cashier slid the receipt toward her and said, "You have a blessed day now." And she said, "You too, baby," before catching herself and smiling at the way a whole lifetime of church basements and block parties had trained her tongue to care for strangers. She walked 2 blocks to the public library, where the marble steps gave way to a hush that felt like a private chapel. She signed in for a public computer and waited her turn beneath a mural of blues and greens that looked like a river carrying books downstream. At the terminal, she searched county records, learning how to filter results by instrument number and how to request certified copies of deeds. She found the notary registry and wrote down the name that matched the faded stamp, underlining it once as if that would make the person more real. She downloaded the form to demand copies from the bank's legal department and filled it out with careful, printed letters, then printed 2 copies and placed them in a manila envelope. The librarian smiled as she handed over a stapler and said that if Angela needed assistance with scanning later, the help desk would be happy to show her the machine. People were patient in this building. It made the work possible. By mid-afternoon, rain stitched a gentler pattern across the city. Angela stepped outside beneath the overhang and watched umbrellas bob down the sidewalk like dark flowers. She called the legal clinic again and left a message that was more precise than the one she had left the night before, naming the parcel number, the suspected forgery, and the notary discrepancy. She called an old friend from the community center to ask for the number of a journalist who sometimes covered housing issues. When the friend texted her the contact, she did not message the reporter yet. She folded the scrap and put it away like a spare key. The bus ride back toward West End carried the quiet fatigue of people finishing split shifts and heading toward second jobs. Angela took a seat near the back where she could see the driver's mirror and the faces that boarded. An older man in a cab nodded to her and murmured evening, and she returned the greeting with the easy courtesy that helped the city feel smaller. A teenager climbed on with headphones, bobbing gently to a beat only he could hear, and offered his seat to a pregnant woman without prompting. The small goodness of it steadied her breathing. She thought of the glass wall in Bennett's office, how it had framed the lobby like an exhibit. She pictured a different frame, her mother's living room, the neighbors who would pull up long chairs to listen if she asked, the choir stand where the altos took a breath together. When she reached her stop, the light had tilted toward the blue hour that settled over porches and made windows glow. She turned the corner toward home and saw Mrs. Goodwin bringing in a cardboard box from her car trunk. The older woman called out a question about the church raffle and whether Angela could bake the sweet potato pie again this year, because last year's had gone so fast. The ushers barely got a slice. They chatted a minute about recipes and the weather, the community stitching itself with simple threads while larger forces tried to pull the fabric apart. Inside, Angela placed the manila envelope on the kitchen table and smoothed its flap like a seam. She completed the letter to the bank's legal department, signing her name with the careful flourish her mother had taught her, then addressed it and affixed a stamp from the roll she kept in the drawer with rubber bands and measuring tape. She made a second copy to send by certified mail in the morning. She gathered the notes from the library, stacked them by subject, and started a list for tomorrow: courthouse records, notary's office, follow-up with the clinic, and a visit to the community center to ask Eleanor if she remembered the time the bank had misplaced the Johnson's title for 3 weeks until a reporter called. Fatigue tried to settle on her shoulders. She kept it at bay by making a cup of tea and washing the mug before she even took the first sip. Routine steadied her. The radio on the counter played a soul standard that reminded her of summers with the windows open and cousins sleeping on pallets in the front room. The song made a promise the day had tried to break, that what is right, when pursued without malice and without surrender, bends the stubborn thing a little closer to just. Sometime after dusk, her phone lit with an unknown number. She answered, and a crisp voice identified himself as someone from the bank's compliance team. He spoke in a tone that suggested both sympathy and finality. He referenced deadlines and notices sent, used phrases like fully compliant and in accordance with policy, and then paused as if preparing to exhibit an ounce of generosity. Angela let him finish. She asked again for the originals. He directed her once more to legal and then, in the same measured cadence Bennett had used, suggested that efforts beyond that would only complicate matters for her. She thanked him for the information and ended the call. She stood at the window and looked out at the curb where the streetlight made a halo on wet pavement. In the reflection, she caught her own face framed by the kitchen's warm light, the same cheekbones that ran through the photographs in the hallway. She could hear the quiet of the house, and, beneath it, the noise of a city that had learned how to endure weather and policy and opinion without letting any one of them make the rules for the soul. In the morning, she would mail the letters, stop by the post office counter, where the clerk always teased her about bringing exact change, and then go to the county building to request certified records. She would carry the envelope to the bus with the same care she had carried permission slips when she had led field trips from the community center. She would eat a simple breakfast, leave the hutch light on for evening, and lock the door behind her twice, the way her mother had done out of habit and faith. But the day was not done yet. She slipped the documents back into the envelope and slid it into her bag. She pulled on her coat and gloves, then walked out into the night air that tasted like rain and wood smoke. She wanted a moment to feel the ground beneath her feet, to look up at the dark shape of downtown rising against the soft horizon. She made her way to the corner, turned toward the high-rise where the bank's letters sat like sharp silver against the sky, and lifted her chin. Then, as if answering a question only she could hear, Angela left the bank, files clenched in her hand, eyes lifted to the high-rise. If no one will help, I will fight on my own. The café near the MARTA station held a gentle hum of late afternoon, the kind that mixed milk steamer hiss with the soft percussion of cups on saucers and the rustle of winter coats shrugging warmth back into shoulders. Angela chose a small table near the window where a draft slipped under the sill and carried in the smell of wet pavement. She set her old laptop on the wood, the casing scuffed and worn from years of use, and opened the legal reference site she had bookmarked at the library. The letters marched across the screen in a small, stubborn font, turning everyday words into a tangle of terms that seemed designed to keep ordinary people outside the gate. She breathed, slow and steady, as if she were smoothing a wrinkled sheet, and began to read aloud in a whisper so soft it sounded like prayer. She had taught other people for years how to fill out forms, how to keep copies, how to ask for supervisors with a voice that was firm and kind at once. Now she wrote a timeline in a small spiral notebook with a pencil that left calm gray lines, the date the deed was recorded, the date property taxes cleared, the date hospital papers were signed when her mother went in for tests, the exact day the suspicious second mortgage appeared. She underlined that entry twice. She made a column for names, notary, loan officer, branch manager. She added a column for things to request, originals, certified copies, the notary journal. Each list steadied her hands. The barista rang up a cappuccino for a student in a puffy jacket, and Angela could see the hodgepodge of bills and coins in the tip jar, the small economy of appreciation, the way a place said thank you even when it was busy. She ordered a plain coffee and left a dollar bill for the staff with a nod. When the cup arrived, its heat settled into her palms like courage. Outside, a train announced itself with a distant rumble that vibrated the window pane. A pair of teenagers laughed over a shared cookie, and an older man at the counter read the sports page with the sad devotion of someone who had loved the same team for a lifetime. She returned to the screen and searched the county records portal again, refining the terms until the database yielded a page that let her compare sample notary seals. Her eyes traced circles, eagles, mottos. The one on the bank's copy looked like a mask of a seal, not the seal itself, too uniform and faint at the edges. She wrote down the notary's name and licensing number from the copy she had, then wrote a question mark beside it so her mind would not claim certainty where there was only suspicion. She opened the new document to draft a request for records one more time, choosing words that were precise but not fancy, because precision, she had learned, made people listen when flourish, made them suspicious. It was only as she paused to flex her fingers that she noticed a young woman watching from the corner where the wall met the window. The woman had a phone face down on the table, a habit she recognized from people who wanted a break from being tugged by 1,000 buzzing strings. Her hair was pulled back, neat, and her gaze moved between Angela's laptop screen and the manila folder open at her elbow. The woman hesitated, as if weighing the cost of a step. Then she stood, smoothed the front of her sweater, and approached with the kind of careful politeness that felt like walking into a room where a child was sleeping. "Excuse me," the woman said, keeping her voice low so it would not flatten the cafe's quiet. "I do not mean to intrude." Her eyes flicked to the page and back. "Are you looking at Southern First Union documents?" Angela considered the distance between curiosity and danger. She had spent a lifetime measuring that gap, choosing when to ignore a slight for the sake of peace, and when to mark it like a line no one would cross again. The woman's face, tired around the eyes, did not hold the empty shine of a clerk reciting policy. It held something like remorse. Angela gestured toward the empty chair. "For my mother's house," she said. A second mortgage appeared that she did not sign. I'm trying to understand how a thing like that can grow legs, the woman said, folding her hands on the edge of the table as if arranging them for a photograph. My name is Maria, she said. Maria Gonzalez. She took a breath that looked like it hurt on the way in. I used to work for their legal team, not as an attorney, support staff, enough to see how files move. Angela listened. The calf thinned around their table, the hiss of milk, the chime of the door, the murmurs, everything sank to a murmur so the conversation could rise. They call it compliance, Maria said. But the word starts to feel like a curtain after a while. The policy on paper is fair. The practice. She looked toward the barista as if the rest of the sentence might be written in chalk on the specials board, then back. There are targeted lists, neighborhoods they consider low risk for lawsuit. You know what that means. Angela did know. She knew it in the way her grandfather had known, when the loan officer's smile tightened at the sight of his hands, in the way her mother had known to keep every receipt flat in the folder, in the way she herself now knew that certain doors open only when someone already inside took the risk of opening them. She said nothing, letting silence do the work of invitation. Maria's hands tightened, and then she released them. I should not say any of this, she whispered, but I watched files from your zip code get pushed faster. I watched signatures float through without questions that would have been asked if the borrower lived across town. I said something once. After that, my hours got cut, and then the project moved without me. Angela understood the price of saying the true thing. It came dressed as professionalism and budget adjustments. It came as a closed door and a hallway that suddenly had no one in it. I have emails, Maria said, the words barely above the hum of the espresso machine. Internal memos. Not from a whistleblower hotline, from the daily feed. Phrases like accelerate and no contact necessary. And a list, color-coded, that should make a person's hands shake. Your hands are steady, Angela said gently. They are not on the inside, Maria replied, almost smiling. A group of students bursting out of the damp and ordered hot chocolate, their conversation loud for a moment and then folded into the room's rhythm. Angela waited until the noise settled to its usual song. If you have these, she said, choosing her words with care, you are carrying something heavy. I cannot ask you to put it down if it will break your foot. Chilo Moore? Maria looked at the window where the street showed itself in reflections. A bus stop sign, a pair of bicycles locked to a rack, a man in the cab waiting with his hands in his pockets. Her voice, when it came, had the clean flatness of decision. It is already broken, she said, just not in a place anyone can see. She reached into her tote and pulled out a thin manila envelope, the kind a person would mistake for a resume or a school project. She set it on the table, not pushing it, not naming it yet, as if respecting the distance between a choice and an action. Angela did not touch it, not yet. Why are you giving this to me? She asked. Sure, she knew, but teaching herself to listen. Because you look like someone who would not use it to grandstand, Maria said. Because you wrote a timeline before you looked for a microphone. Because I do not want to see another person push out of a house whose porch has more history than the bank's lobby. The espresso machine sighed. A child laughed in a booth at the far end as his mother tore a muffin and handed him the larger piece without comment. The world continued stubbornly ordinary, while something extraordinary slid toward the center of the table. Angela opened her bag and took out a small notepad. She wrote the date in full, then wrote the calf's name, the cross streets, the time spelled out, as if she were making a record no one could argue with later. She noted the envelope and who had placed it there. She did not write Maria's last name. She would ask later if the woman wanted it included. She looked up and met Maria's eyes. If I take this, she said, there is a road we cannot step off. I know, Maria said. I tried to stay quiet and keep my head down. It made me smaller than I want to be. Angela reached into her coat, pulled out 2 folded sheets, and placed them beside the envelope. This is a draft of a request for records, she said. I was going to mail it tomorrow morning. I will still do that. But I want you to see that I will not make you carry this alone. If anyone asks, this came to me by mail with no return address. Do not text me. If you need me, call the community center and leave a message for the after-school coordinator. They will get it to me. Maria let out a sound that was half breath, half gratitude. I worried you would tell me to keep it, she said. I would never tell a person to go back into a burning kitchen just because her apron's clean, Angela answered. Finish your coffee. Walk out first. I will count to 80 before I move. That is a long time for a heart. It is a good amount of time for a plan. They sat a moment more, letting the decision settle. Maria stood, straightened her sweater again, and said, Be careful. Angela nodded. Maria left a tip at the counter and thanked the barista, then stepped out into the street where the sky had paled to a soft pewter. Her reflection disappeared into the flow of people heading toward trains and evening shifts. Angela watched the door close and then watched it remain closed. She counted, not aloud, marking each 10 with a slow sip. The coffee gone lukewarm but still kind. A man at the next table asked for a refill. The barista obliged with the easy dignity of small kindnesses. When she reached the number she had promised herself, Angela slid the envelope an inch closer, and then another, the movement so slight a passerby would have missed it. She lifted the flap. Inside were printed emails, each with a subject line that braided policy language into decisions about people's lives, and a spreadsheet whose colors told a story no one in the commercial would want filmed. There was a memo reminding staff to prioritize files from certain neighborhoods because litigation risk remains minimal. There was a thread in which a manager praised the team for accelerating pipeline closures in a way that translated to lock a door before someone could find the right key. There were attachments with initials Angela could trace to the man who had smiled at her in the lobby as if her dignity were a minor inconvenience. She turned a page and found a notary roster that did not match the stamp on her mother's supposed signature. She turned another and found a calendar entry for the day the second mortgage agreement was said to have been signed, blocked out by a company retreat in a different county. Her pulse knocked once at her throat in the way a person's does when the body recognizes both danger and relief. She placed each page back in order, smoothing edges with the side of her hand so the stack lay neat. The barista called last call for pastries, and someone laughed the way people do when they decide to take the last cookie. Angela slid the pages into a sleeve she kept for church programs and funerals, the ones that told true stories about people who had been told too often that they were ordinary. She tucked the sleeve into her bag. She cleaned the table as her mother had taught her to do anywhere she had been allowed to sit a while, wiped a ring of moisture, gathered crumbs into her palm, disposed of them with care. She zipped her coat, wrapped her scarf, and offered the barista a thank you on the way out. That earned her a nod and a "y'all stay warm now." Outside, the air had a bite sharp enough to clear a mind clouded by grief. The sidewalk gleamed. The station platform shivered with a gust as a train announced itself and pulled in like a promise kept on time. On the ride home, the windows turned the city into a ribbon of lights and reflections. Angela held her bag against her ribs like a sleeping child and considered the steps she would take when she reached her kitchen table. Scan, duplicate, seal, address, send one copy to a friend who knew a reporter, send another to the legal clinic with a new message that began not with need but with proof. She would create a paper world so complete that the bank could not step around it without tripping. She would not call Maria. She would not say the name aloud. She would do what the elders in her church had done for decades. Protect the person who took a risk by keeping the risk from catching fire. The bus bumped over a seam in the road as it turned toward her neighborhood. She ran the cord and stepped down into the thin evening. Porch lights glowed like small lighthouses along the block. Someone had hung paper snowflakes in the window, and the cutouts trembled in the draft from a heat vent. At her door, Angela slid the key into the lock and paused. She looked back once at the street where buses and cars carried strangers toward their dinners and their arguments and their brief moments of laughter. Then she stepped inside and set the bag on the table like a carefully wrapped gift. She unzipped it and drew out the envelope again, laying the pages in a single column so she could see the spine of their story. It was all there. The memo, the codes, the colors, the calendar, that did not line up. She could hear Banna's voice telling her the system was not built for her, and beneath it, the older chorus of hands that had signed deeds and leases and paychecks, the voices insisting that systems are made of people and people can be made to answer. She pressed her palm against the stack and let the heat from her skin find its way into the paper. Then she lifted the first page and read it again, slower, as if each sentence were a step down a stair she had built herself. She turned off the kitchen light and walked to the living room where the photograph of her mother held its familiar place over the mantel. She spoke a sentence that was not a prayer and not a vow, but something between them. A sentence that could sit beside soup on the table and hold its own. She returned to the kitchen, opened the drawer, and took out 2 large envelopes and a roll of stamps. She placed 1 set of pages into the first, 1 into the second, and wrote 2 addresses in a hand her mother would have recognized with a smile. She sealed them, pressed each flap with the back of a spoon, the way her mother had once shown her, and set them near the door with her keys so she would not forget in the morning. She poured a glass of water and drank it slowly. The house settled, the neighborhood breathed. She looked down at the final set of pages left on the table, the ones she would keep with her for the meeting she had not yet scheduled in the courthouse she had not yet entered. She did not need to rehearse what she would say. She needed only to tell the truth to the right ear. She sat, let the quiet hold her, and placed both hands on either side of the papers, as if blessing them. Angela looked at the papers, her heart pounding, and thought, this might be the key. Rain had moved in with a steadiness that felt personal, turning the streets of Atlanta into soft mirrors and giving every porch light a halo. Angela woke to the quiet thud of mail on the stoop and the hum of the refrigerator, then stood at the kitchen counter and tried her debit card for groceries she planned to pick up later. The screen blinked back a denial. She tried again, slowly, as if politeness could coax a different answer. Another denial. She called the bank and heard the practiced warmth of a representative explain that the account had been temporarily restricted pending review, that it was standard, that it was policy, that it was not their intention to inconvenience her. She thanked the voice because she had been taught gratitude, even when it felt like lifting a weight. Then stood for a long moment staring at the old ceramic bowl where her mother had kept spare change and recipes, the bowl now holding only a few coins that clinked softly when she moved it aside. The rain let up enough for her to walk to the West End Community Center, where the lobby smelled faintly of copy paper and orange cleaner, and where a bulletin board carried flyers for coat drives and free flu shots and a choir concert the Sunday before Thanksgiving. Eleanor was not at the front desk that morning. A young volunteer Angela did not know offered her a pen and a smile and asked how her day was going. She answered truthfully, but gently, because the young do not need every bruise named. She made calls from a quiet office with a window that looked onto a small courtyard where leaves spun and settled like thoughts. The legal clinic answered with a recording that promised a return call. A housing counselor said the calendar was full but asked her to email documents anyway. When she stepped out, the volunteer pressed a wrapped granola bar into her hand with the solemn pride of someone who had been useful, and Angela accepted with thanks and slipped it into her pocket to eat on the bus. Her phone buzzed on the way down the steps. The message came from Maria. The words were brief. She was all right, but needed to be careful. Someone had reached out from the old department asking about her access. She felt eyes where there had never been eyes before. There was a second message that arrived before Angela could finish reading the first. A screenshot of an anonymous note that said to be smart and stay quiet if she wanted to keep what she had. Angela stopped beneath the awning and let the rain cool, the heat rising to her face. She typed back with care, avoiding names, naming only the weather and a plan to talk later, then tucked the phone away as if it were a bird that needed rest. By early afternoon, the rain turned fine and insistent, a thread stitching the day together. Angela rode a bus toward a diner near the old train shops, the kind of place with a short counter and a pie case that has seen decades of decision-making. The cook called orders in the voice that could carry over a brass band. People in work boots and ties shared space the way small towns do, even in big cities. She slid into a booth and warmed her hands around a cup of coffee that tasted of the kind of honesty that comes from a clean pot and fresh grounds. Denise arrived a few minutes later, pausing at the door as if measuring the distance to the table and to the decision waiting there. She wore a raincoat left unbuttoned and the expression of a person who had slept badly and hoped the morning did not show it. They spoke quietly. Angela asked about the notary stamp that floated on the second mortgage copy like a ghost of a seal. She asked Denise to remember the day that permission had supposedly been granted, to picture the office, the desk, the pen, the names. Denise folded a paper napkin and unfolded it, and then folded it again, the small square becoming a white accordion between her fingers. She said she had stamped many signatures in her time, that people came in to sign things they did not understand, that sometimes she explained, sometimes she kept to the task, that she had learned to stop asking questions when questions made supervisors lean across desks and narrow their eyes. She said the paper in Angela's file did not feel right to her, did not look like it had been witnessed the way witnessing is meant to work, that she would say as much to anyone who asked. Angela felt the crest of hope and set it down the way one sets down a glass on a table too close to the edge. She asked if Denise would testify. Denise looked at the rain on the window and said her hours had already been cut once when she pushed for process, that her rent ate more of her paycheck than it used to, that she had a niece she helped on weekends so her sister could rest, that the thought of losing what little she had made her breath go shallow. She looked at Angela, and the fear in her eyes was not selfishness, but a map of a world where every choice cost. She said she would write something if it could be anonymous, if it would keep her from a hallway with no doors. She said she was sorry. Angela thanked her for the truth, paid for their coffee, left a tip that would say what her words could not, and watched Denise disappear into the rain like a wish someone had folded into a paper boat and set afloat knowing it might sink. On the bus home, she sat near the window and let the city slide through layers of reflection. She held her bag against her side and counted the steps ahead as if counting could build a bridge. Copies to be made, letters to be sent, a call to a friend who might put a story in front of a reporter with the patience to read. She would find a way to keep Maria safe. She would write Denise's concern into a record without making the shape of her life any easier to target. She would ask Eleanor to share not details, but memory, the way elders know to give you a lantern without warning you too loudly about the dark. When she reached her block, the rain had eased, and the air smelled of wet leaves and smoke from a chimney that had not been used since last winter. A child's chalk drawing was turning to soft pastel streaks on the sidewalk, the colors traveling in small rivers toward the curb. Angela climbed her steps and fished for her keys as she pulled the mail from the box. There was a flyer for a church turkey drive, a postcard for a furniture sale, a thin envelope from the bank that felt like a joke told in a room where no one was laughing. She turned the knob, expecting the familiar tug of the lock and the release that carried her into the front room. She did not expect the ribbon of yellow tape stretched across the doorway. For a second, she did not understand. The mind goes first to illusions, a prank, a mistake, a line left by a contractor who would apologize and remove it in a minute. Then she saw the paper affixed to the wood, red as a wound, its letters heavy with authority of people who do not need to raise their voices to be obeyed. She read the words once and then again because the eye tries to make the world kind even when the world is something else entirely. Property foreclosed. The syllables landed like stones in a pocket. She stepped back, steadying herself on the rail. A neighbor on the opposite stoop stopped mid-wave, her hand falling as if weighted. Angela felt old floorboards that had held the weight of her family bend in memory under her feet, even though she was still out on the porch. She thought of the bowl by the door where her mother had kept keys and stamps and small face for lean days. She thought of Maria's message and the screenshot with its empty thread written in neat fonts. She thought of Denise's napkin folding and unfolding, and the small economics that govern decisions in a room with fluorescent lights. She sat on the top step because standing made the world tilt. The rain began again, light enough to feel like a whisper on her coat. Down the block, someone called to a child to zip a jacket. A car hissed past and sent a thin arc of water across the curb. Angela placed the mail beside her and laced her fingers together to keep them from shaking. She let the sting in her eyes settle into a steady burn that would not spill over. People passed and did not gawk because the good ones know how to see without turning pain into spectacle. She watched a drop of water gather on the corner of the red notice until it grew heavy and slid down the page, leaving a clean trail that made the ink look fresher. She could have called the bank and listened to another voice say another version of it is policy. She could have called a friend to come and sit with her on the steps so the night would not feel so wide. She could have let the cold reach the small bones and make a home there. She did none of those things for a long minute that felt like an hour and like a breath all at once. Instead, she thought of the church kitchen where, when the oven failed, the cooks moved dishes to neighbors' stoves and dinner still went on. She thought of a choir holding a note while the organist found the key again. When she finally stood, the street did not change, but the angle of it did. She took a picture of the notice for her record, and another of the tape and the door frame and the house number in the same square. She slid her phone back into her pocket and looked at the porch light, at the dirt under the mat from a week of wet shoes, at the potted plant that had not minded the rain. She thought of the papers in her bag that had become more than paper. She thought of the people their names represented, the ones who had stood with her in kitchens and parking lots and voting lines. She breathed the way you do before you sing and let the air find its way all the way down so it could carry something back up. Angela sat down on the cold step again, the red notice bright beside her in the dimming day, and the words came out the way a truth does when there is no one to perform for and no one to hide from. If I collapse now, they will win. Dai go ne. By the time the courthouse steps came into view, the morning light had the thin, silvery look of a sky deciding whether to rain or to break open blue. Reporters clustered near the entrance, their microphones hooted against the wind that skimmed the plaza and set flags tugging at their poles. Inside, security trays slid and clinked, belts and keys and bracelets passing beneath a scanner's quiet eye. Angela moved through with a calm that did not announce itself so much as settle around her shoulders like a good coat. She had slept lightly, rising before dawn to check the 2 envelopes already mailed, the copies in her bag, the careful notes written in a hand that matched the one framed on the living room wall. She did not hurry. She asked a clerk for directions in a voice that belonged to the place. She took her seat where her lawyer would have sat if there had been one. She placed her bag by her feet and folded her hands. The courtroom carried that careful hush specific to rooms where words become deeds. On one side, the bank's table glowed with dark wood and confidence. Thomas Reynolds, their attorney, arranged his files so the tabs lined up like little flags along a well-defended border. Beside him, Richard Bennett hovered in a suit that looked slightly too new, the knot of his tie pulled with habitual neatness and a patience that read as disapproval from across the aisle. Angela let her eyes pass over them and come to rest on the bench where Judge Edward Hawthorne would sit. She had seen his name in the paper attached to rulings that spoke of order in the kind of tone that forgot order can be turned into a tool. The clerk called the case. People stood. The judge entered with the deliberate pace of someone used to a room standing when he walked in. He sat, glanced over the calendar, and then down at the parties as if checking a box. The opening formalities moved through their paces, as steady as a hymn in the mouth of a choir that had sung it many times. When it was time for the bank to speak, Reynolds rose with practiced ease. He began to read the file as if it were already decided. He spoke of a debt, of notices sent on specific days, of the bank's full compliance with process. He distilled a home into lines of ledger and called it prudence. He held up a photocopy of a photocopy as if it were a notarized truth and let the stale light make it look official. He referenced a signature that, in his telling, told the story of a woman making a choice her family had not known or had not wanted to know. He did not smirk. People who are certain do not need to perform their certainty. When he finished, Angela asked to speak. The judge's eyes paused on her for a breath, the pause of a man deciding whether to humor or to hear. He nodded. Angela stood the way she had once stood at church to give an announcement about a bake sale that would keep the after-school program running through winter. A little taller than she felt, a little stronger than she knew. She named the deed, the day it was recorded, the way her mother had celebrated by calling neighbors to the yard. She named the second set of papers that had appeared when her mother was ailing, the stamp that looked like a shadow of a seal instead of a seal. She named the right to see the original. She handed up a letter with her request written in plain words and the timeline that made the shape of the story visible even to a hurried eye. She did not raise her voice. In rooms like this, strength travels better on a steady current. Reynolds objected to her lack of counsel. The judge assured him the court knew how to keep order. The order persisted, but its edge softened as a bailiff opened the door for the first witness. Denise Harper stepped into the room with the careful grace of someone accustomed to keeping records exact and feelings tidy. She took her oath with a voice that wavered and then found its level. her hands folded in her lap the way they might have on a Saturday morning with coffee and a grocery list. She testified to the practice as it should be. A person appears, shows identification, signs in the presence of the notary, receives a stamp applied to the damp ink of their own name. She testified to the practice as it sometimes was. Photocopies, backdated entries, a supervisor's hand on the back of a chair as he asked if a stamp really needed the ceremony today. When shown the second mortgage document from Angela's file, she leaned forward to study the seal and the signature, then sat back with a breath that had the sound of a drawer closing. It does not appear to have been witnessed as required, she said softly. I do not recall this person. The stamp is faint and uniform, as if reproduced. I do not see my usual notations. Reynolds rose as if propelled and objected on grounds of memory and procedure. The judge sustained in part, allowed in part, and asked Miss Harper to speak only to what she knew and to what she could see. She did. Her words were modest. Modest words, in the right room, can be a kind of trumpet. A second door opened. Maria Gonzalez entered without theatrics, hair pulled back, shoulders squared against a draft that did not exist. She took her oath. She said her name in the way that made it a stake in the ground. Reynolds barely concealed his impatience. He asked whether she had a law degree. She said no. He asked whether she had authorization to remove internal emails. She said no. He asked whether she understood what compliance meant. She said yes, and then defined it in plain English. So complete the clerks, pen stopped for a beat, and then resumed like a trotter finding its pace. She described the list. Neighborhoods color-coded by predicted resistance. Teams praised for acceleration. Files from certain zip codes shepherded through times of low media attention. She did not guess. She read. Angela had brought printed emails. Maria identified them. The subject lines braided policy and practice into sentences that looked mild on paper and sounded sharp when read aloud. The spreadsheet came next, its colors no longer abstract. It placed West End in a column that favored speed over scrutiny. There was a message from a manager congratulating staff on surpassing a target by closing files before borrowers made contact. There was a calendar note from the day Angela's mother supposedly signed, overwritten by a company retreat 2 counties away. Reynolds objected again, now in full voice, claiming privilege and proprietary information. The judge frowned the way a man frowns when a meeting starts to cost him lunch. He asked questions that sounded rhetorical and then began to sound sincere. He asked Maria why she had not come forward earlier. She said she had tried in small ways that cost her hours and then her job, and that today she had decided a roof could not be worth more than her own sleep. The answer drew a ripple through the benches. The judge tapped his gavel once, a small reminder that this was still his room. Through it all, Bennett sat with his jaw set, his gaze on an imaginary point beyond the courtroom's back wall. He flinched only when his name appeared in a thread praising a fast-track list for the quarter. He recovered by adjusting his tie, as if a neat knot could fix a fraying seam. The judge turned to Angela. Do you have anything further? He asked, the question more open than it had been at the start. Angela felt the room tilt toward her. She thought of the front steps with the red notice shining wet, of Eleanor's steady hand on hers, of a bowl of spare change and small faith. She stepped forward so her words could find the air they needed. Mr. Reynolds, she began, and her voice carried without strain. Mr. Bennett, you have spoken of procedure as if it were a mountain no one could move. You have spoken of compliance as if it were a shield. You have spoken of my mother as if she were a rumor in her own home. You have told me the system is not built for me. Today, I will tell you something you did not bother to learn. She let the silence hold for a heartbeat, not for drama, but for clarity. I am a major shareholder of Liberty Partners, an investment fund that has, for years, supported Justice Collective and other organizations that hold institutions to their promises. I do not wear that on my sleeve, because a person should not have to flash a credential to make the truth visible. But you have mistaken modesty for lack of power. I have the standing and the means to pursue this to the last page and the last meeting and the last door. The room breathed in. Reporters who had been half listening straightened with the reflex of people who know a moment when they hear one. Bennett's eyes flicked to Reynolds' face, looking for a strategy that had not been necessary a minute ago. Reynolds' fingers tightened on the podium, and his mouth made the shape of a smile that did not travel to his eyes. Angela lifted a small stack of letters from her bag and handed them to the clerk. These are notices to relevant regulatory bodies, to the state bar, and to a federal agency with jurisdiction over deceptive practices. They include the internal emails, the spreadsheet, and a request for preservation of all records related to West End files. There are certified mail receipts. There are copies for this court. There are copies for the press. She did not look toward the gallery when she said press. She did not need to. The room had already felt the shift that occurs when private injury enters public view. Reynolds attempted a laugh and called her statements theatrics, warned her about defamation, and asked the judge to strike the last as irrelevant to a simple foreclosure proceeding. The judge's eyes no longer wore indifference like a shield. He asked Reynolds whether the bank had the original note with the West signature. Reynolds answered with words that were technically correct and practically evasive. The judge asked whether the notary's journal would show the signing. Reynolds said he could not say. The judge asked whether the bank had any policy that treated certain neighborhoods differently. Reynolds objected to the form of the question. Angela spoke once more, her tone even. "This is not only about my house," she said. "It is about the rules you invoked like a choir, and how you used them to sing some people out the door." A murmur rose and settled. The judge leaned back and removed his glasses, holding them by one temple as if the weight of what he had heard required a recalibration of his vision. He looked at Angela with something like regard, then at Denise with something like respect, then at Maria with something like surprise braided to gratitude. He looked at the bank's table and found no easy place to rest his gaze. He cleared his throat. He asked the clerk to mark the exhibits. He asked a few more questions, whose answers did not change what had become visible, then placed his glasses back on and leaned into the microphone with a small forward motion of a person stepping across a line. The courtroom became so quiet that even the HVAC's low hum sounded like a hell breath. A reporter set down a pen and let the recorder do the work. A man in the second row who had come for another case altogether leaned forward, elbows on knees, as if the verdict in his room might reach into the price of his rent. Angela did not move. She felt the grain of the wood under her fingers, the way an old pew holds marks from decades of Sundays. She did not know what the judge would say. She knew only that she had told the truth with the steadiness of a person who had promised her mother to keep a house standing. She thought of the porch light at home and the bowl by the door, and the red notice drawing in the file where it would live now as a piece of evidence and not as a prophecy. She thought of a neighborhood that had learned to hold each other up when wind tried to take the roofs and the rules all at once. The judge raised the gavel and brought it down in a single, deliberate motion that cut cleanly through the hush. He spoke in a tone that carried to the furthest bench without strain or flourish. The court stays the foreclosure and opens a full investigation into Southern First Union. Thanksgiving morning drew a clean breath over West End, the kind that smelled of roasting turkey and cinnamon and early coffee, and Angela moved through her kitchen with a steadiness that felt earned. The table held neat stacks of paper pushed to the edges to make room for plates, and the vase of eucalyptus clipped short, the green holding its shape in a glass jar that once kept buttons. The red notice that had tried to claim its place in her doorway now lay in a folder marked with a sticky note in her tidy hand, for the file, not for the heart. She had slept, not deeply but honestly, her mind drifting in and out of a dream where her mother wore her Sunday suit and hummed a hymn while straightening picture frames that did not need straightening. She rose before the light and set the oven, wrote a short list on a torn envelope, roast warming, greens to finish, extra chairs from the porch, and then stood at the sink, looking out at a yard that had held children's birthdays and goodbyes, and the 100 small ordinary days that count for more than the big ones when you sit down to do the math of a life. Neighbors began to knock, not all at once, but in a rhythm that felt like a song they had learned together. Eleanor arrived with a sweet potato casserole under a quilted cover, and an embrace that folded Angela into the present as surely as any sentence could. She set the dish down, tugged off her gloves, and took Angela's hands the way elders do when they want you to hear not only the words but the blood memory beneath them. "You did what we taught you," she said softly. "You made the truth sit up and be counted. That is the work." Angela smiled because she could finally do that without feeling like it might crack. She helped Eleanor to a chair with a cushion that had kept its spring through 4 dining room sets and one move from the front room when a cousin needed a place to sleep for a month that turned into a season. Maria slipped in with a cranberry relish that glittered like stained glass and a careful look around, the look of a person learning how to be safe again. She hugged Angela in a brief, fierce tilt and then relaxed when she felt the room hold her. "No one followed me," she said. Tone light, and the joke was thin but brave. Angela heard what lay beneath and nodded toward the stack of envelopes by the door, each stamped and addressed, each a promise to systems that had lately learned her name. Denise did not come, but she had sent a card with a short note. "Take good care of this house and of yourself," and a small grocery store gift card placed between the fold like a modest blessing. Angela tucked the card into the frame on the mantel for the day, letting the living room hold the quiet courage of a woman who was not yet ready to step into microphones but had still found a way to stand. The table filled with casseroles and greens, and the turkey that had made the kitchen a sanctuary since dawn. A pair of kids from up the street shuffled in with their grandmother, carrying store-bought rolls with the solemn pride of couriers. Their laughter skittered up the stairwell when they spotted a bowl of candy that had survived Halloween because no one had remembered it until now. A young man from the community center came by to borrow folding chairs and left with a slice of pie instead. The trade held with a handshake and a promise to bring the chairs back by nightfall. Angela poured tea into heavy mugs and coffee into lighter ones, the measure learned from 1,000 potlucks, and took a moment between pours to look at the faces around the room. There was that quietness people get when they know they are safe for a few hours in a world that does not hand that feeling out as often as it should. Conversation found its way to news, as it tends to do even on a holiday. Someone had seen a morning segment about the judge's order. Someone else had heard that the bank's public relations team had issued a statement about taking concerns seriously and reviewing practices, the kind of sentence that meant more when followed by action and less when stapled to a bad habit. A neighbor asked if Angela planned to sue. She said she planned to finish her plate and wash dishes and call her aunt later. And also, yes, she would be talking with counsel as soon as she chose one, and there were letters in the mail that would do their part to make talking unnecessary for other families. "One door at a time," Eleanor said. "That is how we built the street you see out there. One door at a time, we taught them to mind their manners." The room hummed with agreement. The young do not always know that most progress wears an apron. Angela took a plate to the small table beneath the front window and sat for a minute by herself because even good company tires a heart that has been on the line. Outside, the block carried its own melody, distant cheers from a game, a bicycle bell, the roll of a suitcase for an aunt who would not stay late. She ate slowly and let the day knit into place. On the wall opposite, the photograph of her mother caught the light in a way that made the white of the dress bright and the shadow of a tree branch look like a second veil. She stood and carried her plate with her, set it down on the mantel for a moment, and straightened the frame with both hands. She spoke quietly, not to perform and not to report, but because the room had listened to words like this all her life and knew what to do with them. She said that the house had held when they needed to hold, and that she had learned, finally, the difference between dignified and quiet. That she would keep the porch light on for people who needed to find their way to a conversation they should never have had to start. That she would take rest as seriously as she took resistance, because neither works without the other. She pressed her fingers to the frame, not to bless it, but to steady herself. And then, with a breath that smoothed the ridge in her voice, she whispered, "Mama, we kept the legacy." The sound of a spoon against a pot brought her back to the kitchen, where steam curled from a pan and laughter reached around corners like ivy. She lifted lids and stirred, handed potholders to whoever reached for them, and let the choreography of serving and clearing and returning dishes to their owners write its gentle order over the day. When someone tried to wash, Eleanor shooed them away with the authority of a woman who had outlived 6 pastors and several ill-considered committee chairs. "Sit," she said, soft but absolute. "Talk to each other. That is your job." Angela sat, and she did. Between bites and stories, there were small plans made the way communities make them. Maria would meet with a counselor someone knew in the week, no names in calendars, a neighbor's nephew, a law student home for the holiday. offered to connect Angela with a firm that had done right by a friend's father when a pension got tricky. Someone would come by to rake the yard on Saturday and take a look at the loose board on the back steps. Eleanor would bring the church historian over next week to record a few facts about the house, because facts protect the story when memory tries to skip. Later, when the dishes were done in that particular way, dishes are done on holiday, 2 people at a sink, 1 person drying, 1 person telling a story just long enough to get you through the stack. Angela walked onto the porch with a sweater wrapped around her shoulders. The air had turned crisp and clean, the kind that makes breath look like speech. Lights along the railings blinked on up and down the block in a wave, as timers did their duty. Across the street, a boy tossed a football to his uncle. The catch broke clean, and their laughter traveled lightly across the asphalt. Angela looked at the front steps where she had sat with a red notice beside her and measured the difference. It was not victory exactly, because victory suggests an end. It was steadiness. It was a new foundation poured while the old one still held. Her phone buzzed with a message that was simply a photograph, a news site's headline about the investigation, and a picture of a bank facade that looked, for once, like a place that answered questions rather than asked them. She sent back a heart typed out in words because even on a holiday, she respected the quiet rules of a newly careful life. Then she turned the phone face down and let the evening take its pace. She walked back inside to find Eleanor at the table, holding court over a story about a Thanksgiving in a different decade when the oven had died and 4 houses had shared the load so no one went without. Maria listened as if she were memorizing how to write that kind of day into her own future. On the counter sat a stack of containers ready for neighbors to take home, because part of the joy of a long meal is the second meal it makes possible. Angela tucked the container into a paper bag for Mrs. Goodwin, added a small note that said, "Thinking of you," and pressed the top closed. It grew late the way winter days do, suddenly as if someone had clicked the room 1 notch dimmer. People began to gather their coats and praise the food and promise to call. Angela walked each person to the door and hugged them the way churches had taught her to hug, like a benediction. She stood in the doorway a moment after the last guest, breathing the air that still carried cardamom and sage, then closed the door and let the quiet rise. She moved through the rooms like a lighthouse keeper, turning off lamps, straightening a chair, picking up a napkin dropped beside a cushion. In the living room, she paused again at the photograph. She did not speak this time. She removed the card from Denise and placed it behind the frame so it would live there a while, light pressing through paper to touch paper. On the side table lay the letters she had stamped and addressed that morning, now mailed and out in the world with their small, firm voices. On the mantel lay a single candle burned low. She pinched it out with wet fingers, the old trick her mother had taught her to avoid smoke. Before she slept, she sat at the kitchen table and opened a notebook to write the day as a record. Not because she feared losing it, but because writing makes a thing sturdier. She wrote about the food and the talk and the way the house had sounded when the judge's order came through the radio again at noon, like a song played twice, because the first time had not been enough. She wrote about the chairs borrowed and returned. She wrote about the children chasing each other through the hall with the healthy disrespect for adult schedules that reassures a person about the future. She wrote about feeling tired in a way that meant rest would take. She closed the notebook, set it beside the stack of documents, and turned off the lamp. In the hallway, she straightened one prim habit. Ozen then opened the front door to look out at the block one last time. The porch light cast a gentle circle on the top step. Somewhere a radio played a melody that might have been a hymn or might have been a soul record older than the house. Angela stood with the door open a few inches longer than necessary, listening and letting the cool air find the corners of the room. Children's laughter rings in the yard. Angela opens the door, light pouring in. A new chapter begins. The Thanksgiving table grew quiet after the laughter faded, and in that stillness one could almost hear the long echo of doors that had finally been opened instead of closed. Angela's journey through forged papers, cold offices, and a courtroom heavy with doubt had ended not only with justice for her home, but with a circle of neighbors who reminded her that truth, once spoken, belongs to everyone. The lesson is simple and lasting. Dignity is not granted by institutions, but carried within us. And when joined with compassion, it can outlast fear or prejudice. Like a lamp left burning in the window, even the smallest act of courage can light the way for those who follow. So take a moment to notice the quiet kindnesses around you, the voices that hold steady when tested. And if this story has stirred something in your heart, consider passing that warmth along to someone standing at their own threshold, waiting for the light.